Our Region's Business is sponsored by PNC for the achiever in you. Our Region's Business. Innovation, transformation, momentum. Improving our communities and driving technologies that will shape our region for generations. The collaboration that brings vitality, prosperity, and life to living. Stay with us for the coming half hour as we examine in depth our region's business. Now, here's your host, Bill Flanagan.
Today on Our Region's Business, reinventing a former Coke Works site in the city of Pittsburgh, plus redefining scrap and the metals industry worldwide. But first, a mid-year checkup for our region's, nations, and the world economy. The first half of 2012 sure has been enough to make anybody's heart race. A stubbornly high jobless rate nationwide, lackluster job growth, and of course, turmoil in Europe. Well, Gus Faucher is here to help sort it all out. He's senior economist with the PNC Financial Services Group. And welcome. Good to have you.
Thank you very much.
And I understand you're a relatively recent transplant to our region as well, so welcome to Pittsburgh.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, good to have you. Well, let's talk a little bit. Obviously, the big news this week, and I want to get to the world in a second, but the Supreme Court's upholding of the Affordable Care Act. Any economic implication to what's going on with that decision?
I think the economic ramifications of that are going to be pretty minimal, to be honest with you. There are things that are positives for the economy, things that are negatives from the economy from that. But on the whole, we're not going to be changing our forecast much because of the Supreme Court decision.
Okay, very good. Well, let's talk about the rest of the world and what else is going on. What kind of shape is the economy in right now?
Well, the U.S. economy has slowed somewhat from the end of 2011 and beginning of 2012. We had high energy prices, at least at the beginning of the year. There's lots of concerns about what's going on in Europe. And then stock prices have come down because of Europe, and that's been a drag on growth as well. But there are some positives. The housing market is starting to turn around. We're seeing that both in Pittsburgh but also nationally, so that's good. We do continue to add jobs, although at a slower pace, but I think things should start to pick up as we move into the second half of this year.
How much of an overhang still remains from the credit crisis, the housing bust, and everything else that's putting a drag on?
I mean, there's no question, but that's we're still feeling the effects of that. We have surveys from the Federal Reserve that indicate that credit is still tight, although it is easing somewhat. House prices are down by about 1/3 nationally, and that's a lot of lost wealth for households, and that's restraining their spending. We still have something of an overhang in terms of the amount of homes built, although that's starting to turn around. And then I think just overall, people are still anxious. I think businesses were very scared by what happened. Because of that, they've been cautious in hiring, and so that's weighing on job growth. And I think that until we get over that, things are still going to be soft for the next 6-9 months or so.
Yeah, you've heard that. In some reports, profits have been relatively healthy across industries, but it hasn't really translated into the kind of investment and hiring that it had years ago.
That's right. I mean, profits are near an all-time high right now. Businesses are doing very well, primarily because they cut workers very dramatically, and as demand has picked up, they've seen profitability improve. But they're still a little reluctant to take on workers. I think they're concerned about what happens if something goes wrong in Europe and demand falls again. They're a bit concerned about the political situation and the uncertainty there. So I think businesses are still nervous, and that is a drag on hiring, no question about that.
Well, let's talk about Europe. What the heck does it all mean to the outlook here in the United States?
Well, I think there are three ways that Europe is impacting the U.S. economy right now. The first is through reduced exports. Europe is an important source of exports for the United States, and so to the extent that they're in recession now because of their banking and fiscal problems, and that's weighing on U.S. exports. So that's one drag. Second drag is Europe is an important source of credit for the United States. So a lot of U.S. firms have credit ties with Europe, so they're depending on Europe for cash, and as the problems in the banking system have developed there, that's been resulted in a lack of credit in the United States, so that's a problem. And then the third is through stock prices. U.S. stock prices have come down because of concerns about what's going on in Europe, and that's a big drag on spending, particularly for high-income households. They have a lot of their wealth tied up in stocks, so even though the problems aren't necessarily originating in the U.S., they spread to the U.S. through lower stock prices. That's causing high-income households to be a little more cautious in their spending. They're cutting back somewhat, and that's a drag on the U.S. economy.
So, well, how much danger then, depending on how things unfold in Europe, that it could really hit home in a very big way?
There's no question, but that's the biggest risk out there to the U.S. economy right now is a fiscal crisis in Europe. If Greece were to leave the Eurozone, if there are large banking failures, something like that, then I think Europe goes into a much steeper recession. The European banking system runs into very severe problems like those that we had in the U.S. in 2009, and then I think the U.S. is likely to move back into recession in that case, and the job gains that we've enjoyed over the past few years are wiped out again. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's in the Europeans' best interest to make sure that Greece stays part of the Eurozone, and it looks like the Greeks themselves in the most recent round of elections have decided that they want to remain in the Eurozone, and I'm hopeful that European leaders will do enough to shore up their banking system so that the problems there don't cause the Eurozone to collapse and don't spread back to the United States. But certainly it's a risk.
Let's bring it home a little bit and talk about how all this affects what's happening here in our region. We've been doing relatively well for several years now compared to the nation. Is that continuing, and what's ahead?
Well, Pittsburgh is one of the few parts of the country where employment is actually back up to where it was prior to the recession. So the Pittsburgh area has a strong concentration in healthcare, which tends not to be tied to national economic issues. It's benefited enormously from energy exploration. So the Marcellus Shale development has been a key source of jobs for this area, and that in turn has boosted incomes, it's supported consumer spending and so forth. And then also Pittsburgh during the housing downturn, it never had much of a boom, so when the bust came, house prices fell somewhat in Pittsburgh, construction dropped off, but not to the same extent as we saw in other parts of the country that had a big housing boom and bust. So Pittsburgh was pretty well positioned. What that does mean, however, is that over the next few years, I think growth in Pittsburgh is likely to slow to somewhat below the national average. It has less of the driving industries that are going to lead the recovery from here on out. So there's some exposure to the automobile industry, but not as much as in other parts of the Midwest. There are lots of service industries in Pittsburgh that respond less to national economic conditions. Healthcare, it's great to have healthcare and education during periods when the national economy is doing poorly because it provides some stability. On the other hand, when there's a lot of national economic growth, healthcare doesn't respond as much in kind, and so that means that growth will continue in Pittsburgh, but it is going to lag behind the rest of the country over the next few years.
We're just a tortoise economy, whether we like it or not, right? We don't go as fast as when things are growing, and we don't drop as much when things get bad. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
No, it's not. It's not. I mean, certainly Pittsburgh was very well served during the national recession. The downturn here was much milder, and that's a big plus for the area. But on the other hand, it means it doesn't get as much benefit when the national economy does really well.
All right, good to keep in mind. Gus Faucher from PNC. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Next up, Tube City, a Mon Valley company that's redefined recycling in the metals industry. Stay with us.